Good morning, everyone. In this teaching session, we are going to continue with our broad study of sexual activity in marriage. And today we're going to focus our attention on war crimes that involve sex. And this is a subject matter which we need to at least visualize, or that we need to give a glimpse at, because sooner or later somebody is going to wonder, what is our ethical fabric made of? What things should we consider to be okay, and what things should we consider to be not okay? As Christians, just because we're involved in a war, does that mean that the victorious soldier can take advantage of harmless, or shall we say, of civilians which are innocent of combat? So those are issues that we want to entertain as we go forward. So this is Roman numeral number 3, sex as a weapon and war crimes. A definition. What is the definition of war crimes? And I know that we've all heard the old Latin adage or motto, all is fair in love and war, but we want to see a little bit more of a definition. Number 1, the definition of war crimes is a fairly modern accommodation to our modern sensibilities. In other words, for centuries, there have been war crimes that have been committed over and over and over again. Every time that there is a war, some type of abuse of power takes place. And it has only been in the last 140 or so years that we as human beings have decided that something needs to be done to identify what these crimes are, and maybe to assign punishment to these crimes, because it's not fair and it's not right that innocent people should suffer when they are not the combatants and they are not the ones who are armed to combat. Number 2, war, like any street fight, is never fair. War is a product of man's sin nature. That's the old sin nature. War will always exist under man's, or until man's nature is removed by Christ's work on the cross. Christ's work on the cross is now over, but it has not reached the heart of every human being. It will stop one day. The Bible tells us that the plowshares will the swords will be turned into plowshares, that those plowshares were formerly weapons of war, and that war is actually no more. This will only be accomplished by the Prince of Peace. It will not be accomplished by any American president, any European leader, any Asian monarch or leader, only by the Lord Jesus Christ. He is the only one who can actually bring that about. Number 3, in the theocracy, that would be in the Old Testament nation of Israel, God commanded Israel to go to war. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 19 through 22. To begin with, let's turn in our Bibles to that passage so that we can become acquainted with some of the verbiage. And some of you will not be quite satisfied with the way that it is put down in our section of Scripture, but you will take note of the fact that this issue is touched upon by the Bible, and that it gives us a glimmer, at least, of what should be done in times, or what is done in times of war. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, and let me find verse 19, and let me begin to read. They made war against the Hagarites, Jetur, Naphish, and Nodab, And they were helped against them, and the Hagarites, and all who were with them were given into their hand, for they cried out to God in the battle, and he answered their prayers because they trusted in him. In verse 20, we see that God does take sides. And that surfaces the question, suppose I'm a Christian and I'm on the other side. Does God do something there? And the answer to that is yes, he does. He gives each warrior, each soldier, promises, and the book of Psalms gives us quite a bit of information on that. Next verse. They took away their cattle, their 50,000 camels, their 250,000 sheep, their 2,000 donkeys, 100,000 men. For many fell slain because the war was of God. Now notice that phrase there, the war was of God. There are many factors to consider in noticing or in studying this particular phrase. The war was of God. The first thing that should come to our mind is that God has approved this war. And we would say, well, isn't approval like the second or maybe the third item on the list? Well, we can back up a little bit and say that God wanted this war to take place. He initiated it, and as such, it had his approval. Some people would want to know, why is it that God would want a war to take place? We have to remember that we are talking about wars that take place in the Old Testament, the dispensation of the law, the establishment of the nation of Israel. And in the establishment of the nation of Israel, there is also the establishment of its permanence. There were nations that were hell-bent on destroying that nation, either through battle or through some genetic or some biological means. That particular inspiration was undoubtedly satanic. When the biological means surfaces, we note that many of the tribes that are mentioned in the Old Testament at the time of the Joshua conquest, for instance, as it is being referred to here, was because these nations were chock full of venereal disease. They didn't have penicillin until about 1944, and so they couldn't control the venereal disease. And these people were extremely sexually active. And the temptation and the confrontation with someone who is full of sexual avarice is very difficult to contain. And so the only way to stop some of that disease from entering this nation of Israel, which would have the fulfillment of God's promises, would be to eradicate those individuals who were hell-bent on the eradication of the nation of Israel. Some of those tribes are mentioned in our passage here. Verse 22, for many fell slain because the war was of God, and they settled in their place until the exile. The exile is when Nebuchadnezzar took the people as prisoners of war and made them agricultural slaves in Mesopotamia. So in these verses here, we find this phrase, the war was of God. Let me continue. In today's dispensation, war crimes are recognized by the victor, that is the victorious entity, And then it is followed by adjudication. On the screen, you see an image of somebody standing in front of a crude table, and the people not sitting in benches, but sitting on the ground, many of them having umbrellas that would shed some shade on the people who are sitting in the harsh sunlight. What you have is a genocide suspect standing trial before the Gaka court in Zivu, Rwanda on the 10th of March, 2005. And you are going to say, that doesn't look like a courtroom to me. And you would be right. There aren't four walls surrounding there. You don't have the elegant woodwork that is usually found in a courtroom, but you have court being called, and a person who is accused of a war against humanity or a crime against humanity is now being tried for that crime. So we continue with our definition. Number 4. In today's dispensation, war crimes are recognized by the victor, followed by adjudication. So you have two combating armies. The one that wins says, there were some really bad guys on the other side. Because we won, we need to punish those guys. That punishment is called adjudication. It means that you bring them to court, you accuse them, and then you punish them. But this is generally referred to or called victor's justice. That means that the victorious army now is empowered and has taken on the authority to judge people on the other side who are deemed to be enemies or war criminals. In this particular case, that is, in the case of victor's justice, the victor chooses the place, the country, where the trial is to take place. I think you saw a picture of that just a few seconds ago. The victor also chooses who will be the defendants. The victor also chooses what crimes will be charged. And the victor chooses the evidence that will be presented in trial. And last of all, the victor chooses the sentence, which is usually death. That is what is called victor's justice. And I want to bring this up to you because we want to define what a war crime is. And if a war crime is defined by the people who win, then you have, shall we say, a slanted definition? Letter B. There has been an attempt to rectify this situation, and it is called the Lieber Code. The Lieber Code. Its main author was Francis Lieber. Lifespan approximately 1798 to 1872. This code was issued by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War and distributed amongst the Union military personnel in 1863. Civil War was over April 14th, 1864. So this is roughly a year before the war is over. The Lieber Code held that it was a serious breach of the law of war to force the subjects of the enemy into service for the victorious government, and prohibited wanton violence committed against persons in the invaded country, including rape, maiming, and and murder, all of which carried the penalty of death. just as a slight change or slide of our attention, what is it that happened in the United States right after the Civil War? What happened to the South? Were they made slaves and made to serve the victorious government? Answer is no, because they followed this Lieber Code. Instead, the Union or the victorious government imposed a 100-year penalty on the South called the Reconstruction. During that period, no industry was allowed to be built or constructed in the South, which means that the South was shackled as far as their economy was concerned. There was a governor or a limit as to how much and how far they could go. As a result, the northern states became the center of industry, and the South became, shall we say, an agricultural nation. But they were not made to serve as slaves in northern factories. And people from the South could leave and go to the North, which they did, and work in the North. That's the Lieber Code. After the Civil War, the next major conflict was World War I. And the International Criminal Court was established. Immediately following World War I, the victorious Allied powers convened a special commission on the responsibility of the authors of the war and on enforcement of penalties. I know that the print is awfully small. I thought I made it bigger, but I guess I didn't. Letter B. The Commission's report recommended that war crimes trials be conducted before the victors' national courts. Okay, remember how we mentioned where are these trials supposed to take place? Under this particular International Criminal Court, it was decided that the war criminal would be taken to the country of the victorious nation and there be tried by those courts. So let's say for some reason or other that the United States was at war with some country in Europe, some small country, and that they located a war criminal, they would bring him to the United States where he would be tried. And so that is what was decided at that time. However, it was also decided that maybe at the appropriate time that all the nations that were allied, that became victorious, that they could assemble a tribunal of their own and hold court against this war criminal. So that would take it out of the hands of one particular nation. If there were, like in World War I, several nations that got together to defeat the Axis powers. The Allies prepared an initial list of about 900 suspected war criminals and submitted the list to Germany. Although the heads of state traditionally had enjoyed immunity from prosecution, this commission's main target was Germany's Emperor, or the Kaiser Wilhelm II, whom most of the Allies wished to hold responsible for numerous violations of the laws of war. Wilhelm, however, took refuge in the Netherlands, which refused to extradite him, and he was never tried. So this is something that history has seen repeated on many times, and that is that a criminal is found, but he goes to a nation that doesn't have extradition treaties, and that person gets off scot-free. And so when that person gets off scot-free, those damaged civilians of the defeated country or the other country feel that justice has not been taken to the proper level. A compromise then was reached, whereby the Allies permitted a small number of the suspects to be tried in Germany before the Supreme Court in Leipzig. These prosecutions resulted in few convictions. Surprise. With most sentences ranging from a few months to 4 years in prison. So people are saying, that doesn't seem like justice to me. Do you know what these guys did? The next item, or the next step in the evolution of trials against war crimes, is defined by what is known as the Moscow Declaration of 1943 and the Potsdam Declaration of 1945. Both of these were issued by the United States, followed by Great Britain and the Soviet Union, and much later China. These declarations address the issue of punishing war crimes, particularly by the German and Japanese governments after World War II. At the war's conclusion, representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, and the Provisional Government of France — remember, France was basically destroyed in World War II. They had to start a new government with de Gaulle. They signed the London Agreement. These nations signed the London Agreement, which authorized an international military tribunal to try major access as in the access powers, war criminals whose offenses did not take place in specific geographic locations. This agreement included the Nuremberg Charter. On the screen, you have a photograph that is taken of one of the more famous trials that has taken place. This is not one of the Nuremberg trials, but it was fashioned after the Nuremberg trials. And this is Adolf Eichmann, with the day that he was pronounced guilty in Jerusalem in the year 1961. Adolf Eichmann was one of the commandants in the Nazi military, and he was one who was the commandant over the concentration camps, who oversaw the mass killing of Jews. And he went to a country that didn't have extradition. Maybe there's a movie out now that you can rent and see. He went to a place called Argentina, which is right across the river from Uruguay. These two nations today, if you are familiar, are heavily populated with former Nazis. Somebody from Israel figured out a way to sneak into Argentina, find Adolf Eichmann, abduct him, and bring him to Israel to stand trial. This happened as late as the 1960s. His trial his pronounced guilty in 61. I think his trial lasted over a year. Okay, once again, this agreement included the Nuremberg Charter. The Nuremberg Charter codifies crimes against peace, which involve the preparation and initiation of a war of aggression. It also defines war crimes, which included the ill treatment, or which included murder, ill treatment, and deportation. In other words, transporting large numbers of people from one place to another. And if they don't do it by rail or some mechanized way, they march them as the Japanese did so many people across the Philippines. It also defines crimes against humanity. And you would say, well, like what? Well, let me give you some examples. There's murder and extermination. Extermination is the act of killing a large group of people. So they might go into a village and kill everybody in the village. That means that families would be completely eradicated. Enslavement. When I was a kid, and I was growing up in Chicago, there was a lady that lived in my building who had the Nazi tattoo on her forearm. She was a slave in a concentration camp. People today say, no, that never happened. There are people who have their head in the sand. And they think that just by saying that something never happened, that it never happened. Deportation, that's the removal of people from one nation to another. Torture. Sexual violence, and this is bringing us closer and closer to our subject matter. This includes rape, prostitution, forced pregnancy, and or sterilization. And I might also add the mutilation of genitalia. Persecution of a group based on politics, race, nationality, ethnicity, culture, religion, or gender. Next, enforced disappearance, either by a government that has authorized abduction or imprisonment. We don't hear very much of this, but it's very prevalent in South America, particularly in Argentina, where a family is all of a sudden lessened or diminished in number because the government has abducted a son, a daughter, a father, or somebody, and the family never hears whatever happened to this kid or this person, just gone. Protests have been going on for over 30 years. Release the names of those who are imprisoned. Some are in prison, some are in common graves. That is a war crime. Okay, here are some examples of Nazi war crimes. Testing the drinking of seawater. Prisoners were starved and given nothing but seawater to drink for approximately 3 months, for the purpose of testing how to make seawater more drinkable. Secondly, experiments involving poison. Prisoners were secretly poisoned so that they could be studied as they died from the effects. If they did not die right away, they were killed so that their bodies could be studied under autopsy. Thirdly, incendiary bomb research. Prisoners would be burned with phosphorus so that different medications could be tested to see how well they treated the burns. Immunization experiments. Scientists would infect patients with various diseases, including malaria, tuberculosis, typhus, among others, in order to test vaccines and treatments. The collecting of Jews' skeletons. Jews' skeletons were collected in an attempt to put them on display to show just how inferior the Jewish race was compared to the German race. These are examples of some of the war crimes in World War II. Biblical documentation. First of all, some obvious observations before we get into some Bible verses. Letter A. War involves mass killing, often without humane feelings, even if the killing event is short and swift. B. Prolonged wars result in brutality, mass extermination of races, and intolerable atrocities on innocent civilians. Okay, once again, I'm not just talking about war crimes, I'm talking about what happens when you have a war. And you have heard me say repeatedly, I completely support the executive's command to send troops to far-flung portions of the globe so that the conflict is kept off of our shores. If people want to kill each other, they can do it someplace else. They don't have to do it here. And our liberals, the liberals that are in this country, are so blind and so overcome with their bleeding hearts that they don't understand the harm that they wish to bring upon this nation. In war, all rules are kept on the back burner. Yeah, there may be international laws, but who is going to enforce them? And you know who's going to suffer? The civilian, the farmer, the family that got caught up in a war that was designed by somebody else. All rules are kept on the back burner, and what matters most is victory or defeat. You say, well, that's the nature of war. Yeah. Do you want that on your shores? Letter D. Weapons and tactics have undergone total transformation in the last 200 years, but no deterrent has managed to quell human conflict. In other words, weapons get better and better at killing, but nobody has designed something to stop what makes people or what inspires people to go to war. Well, let's take our break at this point. We'll begin next time with warnings, biblical warnings to the nations, and we will begin at that point. Let's stand and be dismissed.